Dennis, are we just going to get into this? Yeah, we're going to get into
Ready
it.
to go?
I'm ready to go.
All right. So good evening, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Everyone in the room can hear me? Okay, thank you. I think that's a yes. Little louder, okay.
I can do that. I got
I'll
you.
pick it up a little bit. How's that? So I'm Dennis Rodoni, District 4 Supervisor. Thank you all for attending tonight. It's a great turnout. Hello to everyone that's on Zoom. A couple technical things tonight. If you have a question, we have cards that we're handing around that you can put your question on. And in Zoom, certainly submit your questions into the chat. We're going to try and compile as many questions together as we can and cover as many as we also can tonight. I wanted to start just by, and also we have Olivia with us tonight over here who's doing Spanish translation. This is the fourth time that we've done translation in our community conversations, mostly in West Marin, but also Eastern San Rafael, and we think it's really useful, especially when we have a Zoom audience. So thank you, Olivia. I also want to recognize tonight with me Fernando Beretta and Morgan Patton, my two aides joining me tonight. Many of you have gotten to know Fernando with his work in Point Reyes Station on Mondays and his work with the Tea Ranch down here with the Land Trust. This last few weeks, there's been some major milestones met here in Bolinas, so I just want to recognize those starting. The Tea Ranch residents moved into their RV housing in the last week or two, and thank you all. Really a great moment for them that we had a little celebration here on Sunday. Hopefully some of you attend, and we're so happy to see that happen before the winter set in. Talking about winter, hopefully you got a notice from DPW recently in the mail. I know your mail is a long ways away. It's a touchy subject for sure. I saw it's 250 days now without a post office, and I do apologize for that. Point of this is getting ready for winter. They're projecting a wet winter this year, starting maybe even next week with our first atmospheric river. So get ready, clear your gutters, clear your storm drains, and get ready, and that helps us all to deal with the winter storms better. So I just wanted to mention that. Someone's in the back. Thank you. A couple things I wanted to mention, just some updates on the county level. We have a very healthy county budget. We're projecting no deficit for the next 2 to 3 years, up to 5 years. So we have had a good team managing our budget, and we're very fortunate that we will not be doing any cuts at all in the near future. And in fact, we're looking forward to some additional funding be available for those priorities, those one-time priorities that are needed in our communities. There are some challenges on that front. Healthcare has really taken off. Healthcare costs has really taken off. And also with inflation still on the horizon, we're concerned about those two things related to the budget. Reusable foodware ordinance that takes effect November 10th in unincorporated Marin, along with 10 of the 11 cities in Marin, is something that you'll be noticing, because this is an ordinance that essentially bans single-use plastic coming out of our food establishments, our fast food establishments, our delis and things. And this is a county ordinance that aligns the products we do use, which ones that are compostable or recyclable in our waste stream. And that's really important, because you've kind of been sold a bill of goods by the industry that the plastic line products are compostable and they're not in our waste stream. And that's something that we also need to deal with. But this ordinance starts to educate people about the type of products that you should be seeing come out of your food establishments and the type of products you're taking home, hopefully making them more manageable and being put in your proper waste stream so they actually get composted or reused as recycle. Just wanted to mention Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority has been doing a lot of work David is in the audience, former board member there, and helped to get that agency started. We work with the Bolinas Fire District, and hopefully you'll start seeing more and more projects out here as we maneuver with the coastal permit process. But primarily it's been related to home hardening and vegetation management around your home. So hopefully you're aware of that, getting inspections and taking advantage of the grant programs if you are low income and need help doing that. You know, a lot of challenges around home insurance. That's really not a county issue, but we're well aware of that. But some of the work that MWPA is doing is being noticed by the state. And I think that'll help us out in the future when it comes to insurance companies making choices about who they insure and who they don't insure, because they're also recognizing the work we're doing. For those of you who don't know, we have some major projects going over in Central Marin, one in the Ross Valley, a shaded fuel break that's going from Larkspur all the way up through Kentfield and around Fairfax, a shaded fuel break in Novato that's going around the entire community of Novato, and then one on West Santa Fe between Santa Fe and San Anselmo. What shaded fuel breaks are is where you go in with crews and you clean up the low limbs on trees, the vegetation on the ground, cut the grass, and what you do is you create a space where the fire actually lays down when it approaches that area. So they're looking at 100 to 300 feet from urban developments into that wildfire urban interface and doing this treatment. And it actually is pretty impressive because most people think of fire treatment as fire roads and clearing. This is a much gentler treatment that actually has the same results, and the forest and the trees look better afterwards, especially a few months afterwards. But this is a process that will take a lot of maintenance over the years. This measure's in place for 9 years, thanks to the voters, and it creates $20 million a year. Emergency preparedness has been a priority in my office, and we really are making some important strides there. We reorganized the Office of Emergency Services and the Office of Emergency Management. We hired a brand new director, the first time it's had a director, and we actually committed $1 million a year for staffing to make sure it's staffed properly for the future. They're about 6 months into the reorganization, but we've already seen many benefits from that. And the last thing that we also shifted it from the sheriff's office over to the fire department. And all that's been very productive. So we're happy about that. And you'll probably hear more and more about that too from your local emergency preparedness people. Marin County fire crews have been increased up to 4 crews now, 4 20-person crews. We had 1 not long ago, 2 just 2 years ago, and with state funding and additional funding, we now have 4 fire crews. And what the advantage of that is that we have people to fight fires that do the handwork, which is really a big advantage, but it also means that they can do vegetation work when they're not fighting fire. So we have crews all over Marin doing vegetation work. 2 of them are stationed at the National Park Service in Point Reyes, and 2 of them are in the San Geronimo Commons, which is the temporary fire administration's headquarters. In January or early next year, we're proposing, my office and the Office of Equity is proposing an $18 an hour minimum wage. It's the first time Marin will entertain a minimum wage, and we just think it's important to start talking about that. And we're looking for possibly increasing that to $26 an hour by 2030. So it's a significant proposal. We understand that 18 is not enough, but we want to start us on a pathway that we can approach a decent wage for our residents in Marin. And this will be for unincorporated Marin, so it will affect all of you out here. You know, the housing element was approved. The county housing element was approved. Many of you are aware of that, especially with the short-term rental discussions going on. And now we're implementing programs to start getting into that housing element and figuring out ways what programs are appropriate for helping us develop housing. Marin County unincorporated has 3,600 potential housing units it needs to build in the next 8 years. I think there's a couple projects potentially in Bolinas, at least one of them is already been approved. It's the project across the street from here. But there's not a lot of impact from that housing element on Bolinas in terms of new housing. We have a Bolinas parking proposal that we've been working on. Originally, we worked on Measure X, and that didn't prove to be as successful as we hoped for. It was a 2-year pilot, and then we extended it for 2 years, and it will expire, I think, in November, I believe. And that we're going to let that expire because it's not been a useful tool. It hasn't worked the way we had hoped, but we've been working with the parking committee headed by Bruce and Sherry to come up with a new plan. And the new plan actually includes some permit parking on Brighton and Wharf, residential permit parking. It's a plan that would allow those on the residential side of the street, and especially on Brighton, to get parking permits, up to 2 per residence. And those would be administered by the Bolinas Community Public Utility District, and they will be issuing those in conjunction with an MOU with the Sheriff's Department. The sheriff will do the enforcement, and this is a targeted effort. It may sound weird to you initially, but it's a restricted parking from 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. And the reason we're putting the time limit on it is because that's when the sheriff's office can do the enforcement. They can come through during that time frame and be able to do enforcement and write tickets for people that are illegally parked. And so this would be on the residential side of the street on Brighton. And then this would yet to be determined on Wharf. We need to actually do some more work on Wharf Road to determine exactly where that would be. But we're building it into the permit process, so we don't have to go back out and get a permit for Wharf Road. So it's likely going to be phase 1 and 2, although that could change. But we haven't really had a lot of conversations with the residents on Wharf Road yet. And we have had a lot of conversations, including a poll that was done by the parking committee on Brighton. So the other thing that's coming along with this is 2 things I'm going to announce tonight, is that the 22-foot length limit is going to be put in place on the non-residential side of the street on Brighton. And that would be, again, effective from 11 a.m. to 5 a.m. And that's the proposal. And then there would be a restriction of 22-foot on Wharf Road south of the museum to the beach. And so we're putting those on because both those roads are narrow and restrictive, and we want to make sure that long vehicles aren't allowed to go in there and be parked there. So that's in conjunction with the permit. The other thing that is going to be happening in the new year is we're going to add a 500-foot moving on the 72-hour rule. 72-hour rule right now just does not have any distinction of how far you have to move. So literally you could roll your tire a quarter turn and that would meet the requirement to start a new 72 hours. The whole county is going to put in place, unincorporated Marin, in place a 500-foot minimum requirement for moving that vehicle in the next year. And that will apply here in Bolinas too. So you have to move 1/10 of a mile is what that is. And that's very common with which other cities have throughout Marin. So that's going to be coming as a separate item, but the parking permit program is going to a coastal permit, and the schedule for that is, for those that are interested, talking about it tonight. I'm happy to answer any questions about it tonight, and Sherry and Bruce can answer any. Also, November 9th, it's going to BPUD for a discussion. I'm sorry. That's not B, it's the subcommittee tonight. Parking committee, thank you. And then the 15th, it's going to BPUD for a discussion. And on November 16th at 10 a.m., the county will be holding the hearing on the parking permit. And so that will happen. And then once the coastal permit is approved, which we think it will be, and this is a local decision by local planners because it's part of the local coastal plan, there'll be a short period of potential appeal, and then it will have to go to the Board of Supervisors for final approval at some point. But it's looking good, even though we intended to have that in place last spring. I think we've got a good shot at having that in place this spring. So more to follow on that, and I'm happy to answer any questions on that. Yeah, that the 22-foot on Brighton is 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. I'm sorry if I said a.m. And then the parking permit is 2 to 5 a.m. So, yep. And parking permit, just so you know, you have to display it on your card, something BPUD will issue. It has to be permanently affixed to your car. You have to be the resident or person that lives at that residence. It's not for guests, and it's limited to 2. And then there's one other limit. We can't issue parking permits for no more than 50% or less of the total parking area. So again, that's sort of keeping it open to the public. So we're putting that restriction, no more than 50% of the total parking available can be used for residential permits. We think the numbers work, that almost everyone can get 2 permits and will still be well under that number. So Dark Sky International has been a subject that you've probably heard about. Point Reyes Station, it started with the National Park Service trying to become a reserve, a Dark Sky International Reserve, which would allow any community around the park to join. That process stalled a little bit because of their resources, and the county's now been asked to step up. The question I have for you tonight in the Bolinas community, and this is a great forum for it, is whether you expressed the interest in the Dark Sky International when the Park Service was doing the program. Are you still interested if the county does a program, with the understanding that there's a requirement in Dark Sky that you have to do enforcement at some point in 10 years at the latest of any lighting that doesn't fit the Dark Sky International requirements. And so I just wanted to make sure everyone knew that not only signing on to this and being part of the county program, it would involve ordinances that we would have to develop, which follows the Dark Sky requirements, and we have to actually enforce those ordinances over the next 10 years. So we do have a little time to allow time for change out of lights and lighting and light bulbs and street lights and things, but it is something that we're signing on to, and we're taking it very serious. So we want to know which communities on the coast want to be part of this. So we'd be anxious to hear what the Bolinas community wants to be part of that, and maybe through Will and his group, and this group here is a great forum to make that statement, and perhaps send us a letter at some point saying you want to be part of that discussion with the county. Just a note, Caltrans improvement, they're still doing the repaving of Highway 1 from Dogtown almost to Tamales, a major repaving project. They think they might be ready at the end of 24, but at least they'd have the contract ready at that point, and then they would do the paving in the project the following year. You may see earlier than 2024 some culvert work being done because they have plans for replacing some culverts before that. And the good news is that the state of California, under its broadband initiative, is planning to put broadband the entire length of Highway 1 throughout Marin, north to south. And that's the connection, that's the middle mile that everyone needs to connect to broadband and high-speed, good quality internet for all our communities. Recently, the county, because of communities that have the highest need, have identified Dillon's Beach and Tamales and Muir Beach as 3 of the communities that we're going after initial federal grants for, to tie into that middle mile, to do the last mile into those communities. And this is an open network if the county does it, which means that you're not tied to any AT&T or any other network. You can sign up with anyone you want at any time and change anytime you want, because the county will own the network basically. And you as the end user can choose who you sign up with. So there'll be a box at your house, essentially, similar to what the telephone box used to look like if you had landlines. And that would be your broadband box, and then you would make the agreement with whoever you want to provide that service, and they would finish the connection. Again, broadband will bring us much safer and resilient internet. So that's my announcements around county issues. And I see there's a lot of short-term rental signs in the audience, and I know there may be questions about short-term rentals, and I'm certainly happy to address any of those. But what I thought I might offer to start with other things first, because I think once we start talking about short-term rentals, my thought is we might get really well into the weeds and into the night. And I wanted to make sure that other people had an opportunity to raise an issue that might be important to them. And we're kind of open to anything. Again, just a quick update on the post office. I don't have much for you. You probably know as much as I do. The temporary plans were dismissed by the postal department, postal office in the Bay Area. They agreed to a revision to enlarge the size of the temporary facility. Your community did that revision and redid the plan, submitted it. It was rejected again. And so the congressman's office decided to take a different approach and work with the community now to make the temporary a permanent post office proposal, because permanent is subject to how long, we don't know. But we're hoping that would convince them at least that they have a permanent option here in Bolinas. And so we're still waiting. I know it's been 250 days, and I know it's been a real hardship for many of you. So I do apologize. The congressman's office is working hard on it, and I'm talking to Jenny weekly at least about it. Question in the back. Yeah, repeat the question. It's being asked, if the Waterhouse building became available again, do I think the post office would come back? I believe so, because they've always said they're not out of Bolinas for good. They just need an opportunity. We've provided some opportunities, but in their mind, it's not permanent enough. So if that were to happen, I think that would be a good proposal for them. And there may be other proposals that are out there too, to try and get them here back with a permanent place. But, unfortunately, those are a long time off. And we would have hoped they would have taken the temporary option, which made total sense to everyone else but them. Go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you.
The first one is, how much of the W tax, the additional 4%, goes towards affordable housing? And how much goes to CLAM per month? Where specifically does the rest go?
So you're referring to what was Measure W. That's a 4% increase in the transit occupancy tax, the TOT. The base rate is 10%. And the way that was structured, the ballot was structured, all that 10% goes to the county general fund. Doesn't necessarily come back to our community. So when I got elected, I wanted to bring some money back to our community. And one of the ideas I came up with was to increase the TOT 4%. And the voters supported that in 2018, I believe it was, to approve that with a 2/3 vote, 67%, 8% voted for it, to increase it to 4%, which generates about $1.5 million a year in West Marin. And the TOT Measure W district includes San Geronimo Valley, sort of the broader West Marin, just so you know. And so that's 2% of that money goes to the Marin County Fire and Fire Districts for emergency services, because one of the things we knew, there was a drain on emergency services from our visitors. So we thought this was a good way to support our fire districts in Marin County Fire. And then 2% goes to permanent housing, permanent meaning housing that was used for community members. And that is determined by a group of a working group that every year gets together and decides what buckets of money they want to commit the funding to. And I think Ariane was previously sat on that committee, went to things like rental assistance, housing, and then I think they set aside 5% for future projects so they could build some funding up. there's several buckets of funding there, and that is all stipulated by the ballot language. They can't do anything outside the ballot language. It has to go and support permanent housing for residents. So that's a stipulation. And then people apply for grants based on what those allocations are. So no one gets funding every year. Depends on the project. I think we've supported, I believe, almost every project. Measure W has supported almost every project in Bolinas that's built affordable housing in some way. Ariane's shaking her head no, most of them. And that's what it's for. It's really to support for building housing, affordable housing, workforce housing in West Marin. And certainly CLAM has taken advantage of that. Hopefully, I think the Simpson Beach Affordable Housing Group has taken advantage of Measure W. And so again, it's generated $6.5 million since 2018, which is a great help, but you know how expensive it is to develop affordable housing. So, it takes other sources too. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yes. All right. Thank you for your support of BCLT. Please tell me your position on protecting local renters as the housing crisis worsens. There is zero housing to rent on the coast right now, while there are plenty of short-term rentals available. What are you doing for rental protections like just cause laws and as rent rises?
Sure. So we have enacted just cause laws, policies in the County of Marin, and under our housing element, which we submitted to the state, we also have committed to expanding tenant rights, again, to protect tenants that are in existing housing. You know, what the question points out is that permanent housing is limited in all of the coast, and I know you're struggling here in Bolinas. And so what we're attempting to do at the county in 2017 and 18, we developed a good neighbor policy at that point, signaling that short-term rentals were impacting our communities and we needed to develop more regulation related to short-term rentals. COVID hit, which kind of stalled that process. And then as COVID was ending, we took it up again. 2 years ago, next March, we put the moratorium in place to kind of hold it where it was so that we could have a timeout and find some time to have conversations in all our communities to figure out what people thought and what they wanted. And we've done that over the last 18 months. And now we have had draft regulations that came out in September, went to a workshop at the Planning Commission, and then we'll go again next Monday to the Planning Commission for community input and more input from the community. The new revised, new regulations have been very much revised based on conversations that we've heard and had, and the Planning Commission had, mostly clarifying a lot of things. One of the things that it clarified was if we're proposing caps, that the caps included both unhosted and hosted short-term rentals. The initial proposal said hosted short-term rentals weren't counted in the caps. That was an actual mistake. It should have been they were counted in the caps. And so the new proposal, as redrafted, that came out last week, and the Planning Commission is going to address next week, has the caps as a total, both all short-term rentals count in the caps. So for example, and I'm probably getting off the question a little bit and into short-term rental. So getting back to housing, I mean, it's a real struggle for housing in all of West Marin. I've lived here all my life. It's been a struggle as long as I can remember. I understand that kids I went to elementary school in West Marin School didn't end up settling here, either weren't able to, couldn't afford, or there wasn't work here for them. So there's a lot of reasons why people can't stay here, but housing certainly is a major issue, and availability of housing is a major issue. And that's why we continue to seek out programs to build more housing, why we're working with the Land Trust on the Mesa pilot program to help build ADUs in those neighborhoods up there that would provide more permanent housing for people here. So, we're doing all kinds of things to help develop affordable housing, but we're way behind in workforce housing. We're way behind in doing this. The whole county is behind in building housing. general supply of housing is way behind. So, we're playing catch up, and I totally get where people come from, that short-term rentals are displacing us and taking away permanent homes. The reality is that a lot of those homes are second homes that may or may not be permanent homes should short-term rentals be eliminated in its entirety. We don't know, we don't have the proof of the data of that. And so what we're attempting to do is find the correct balance to keep our communities vibrant, to keep our communities with workers that live in them, to keep our school teachers in our community, and at the same time recognizing that short-term rentals are not going to go away. There's something that we've kind of been caught with in terms of residential zoning, because short-term rentals have not been memorialized in the residential zoning codes. They just weren't part of them. They weren't recognized. As B&Bs were, but short-term rentals have never been really recognized. So we're playing catch up. And that was a reason for the moratorium, to kind of stall it all, give us time to come to reasonable regulations. And I think that's the point, is we're trying to develop reasonable regulations, because there's expectations on both sides of the equation. And I'm sure you've read and heard a lot about those. But housing is a real issue, and that's why we're working so hard with the land trusts. We're so blessed with the land trusts that we have in West Marin, our affordable housing groups. We're embarking on a countywide land trust right now because of the models that we've seen out here working so well. And the land trust has made such tremendous strides in keeping housing affordable and keeping people housed. So I'm totally grateful for them, and we have a great partnership with them, and hopefully we'll continue to work with them to not only find new, but protect existing housing. So, next question.
Okay, I'm going to take us off of housing, and then we'll come back there. Does Recology accept compostable cups and utensils in our green bins, or are those compostable in name only?
What was the last part of the
Are
question?
they compostable in name only?
So, yes, on Recology, if it's truly compostable material. If you flip the cup over and it says commercially compostable, then Recology tosses those in the garbage, because they're commercial compostable means that they deal with the plastic line products. And what's wrong with the plastic line products is you can't create organic compost with those. There's too much plastic in them, quite honestly. And so that's the reason why we think the ordinance is important, to really educate people about what sorts of products you should be using, or asking your coffee house or your favorite restaurant for takeout food what types of things you should be using, so that you can make sure they're recyclable. But people are often misled by the fact that it says compostable, but if you read carefully, it says commercially compostable, and that's a whole different issue. So the plastic industry has really done a good job marketing the plastic line products that they claim are compostable, but quite honestly, it's a very expensive process. Very few places do it, and the end product is inferior. So you don't get the return on the compost that we do here in Marin, which reduces your garbage rates at the end of the day, because the compost is worth more for the garbage people. So,
All right. Another topic. A group in town is exploring the possibility of building and operating a community swimming pool facility. Would you support this project? Are there any county resources and funding sources that may help the process?
yeah. Thank you for the question. I'm well aware about the idea of a pool, community pool, and I think it'd be a wonderful project to have in this community or other communities in West Marin. We don't, in my mind, little pet peeve is the federal government doesn't invest in our communities enough around things like pools and recreation centers and stuff. But the county certainly would be supportive of this, and we'd be able to help with some funding support for sure. We'd be able to help in grant writing almost daily, if not every other day. I'm writing a letter of support for some project for grant funding. And there are opportunities out there through parks money, county parks money, state parks money, So there are opportunities. It really is getting to a site and getting it to a point where it's feasible, some sort of planning document that would show it would be feasible, and buy-in of the Mesa Park or wherever it might be that's going to own the property. That's the place to start. And then if you can expand it and open it up to the rest of the West Marin and other communities, that would even be better, because it would make it more desirable for grant funders. But yeah, I'd love to talk more about that. I've actually talked to some of the pool people saying, I'm glad to support that, and we'll find infrastructure money in the county for that at some point when they're ready to build it, and we certainly would help support it. And other ideas, we recently talked about the baseball field needing some support here in Bolinas, and we've offered to help them too. Thank you, Morgan.
All right, and the next question, will we be able to vote on new parking measures like we voted on Measure X?
We don't plan to take this to the voters. We think we've done a good job with working with the residents that are affected and on Brighton, and then we will work more with the people on Wharf, because I don't really feel, I think this is a more specific and targeted approach to really address the issues on these two streets downtown, where Measure X had a broader impact. And so I think it was actually the BPUD or someone locally decided to take it to a vote to see if there was support. The county proposed it, and then the community took it to a vote. So you certainly could. This is going to be rejected or approved on November 17th or whatever it was. So it's coming up for that approval, but it won't be implemented that quick. So if you wanted to have a vote, ask BPUD to do it. If it was something that people rejected, then the county would probably respect that. But I think this is pretty well supported as far as I can tell, and it would protect that residential neighborhood that is inundated now with large vans and things overnight. And this would prohibit that along the neighborhood fronts, where some people can't see out of their front yard because of the setup in front and stuff. So it's not just to address that, but it's also to make sure that people that have residences on those streets have an opportunity to park in front of their house at some time during that day. So we think this is a good solution. We've talked about it. I think Sherry said 4 years. It's probably true if you include Measure X. And it predates me by 10 years, probably, talking about parking in Bolinas. So one of the things I always say is I'd rather do something than worry about not being perfect. And if it doesn't work like Measure X, we'll pull it back and try again. But we feel like we've kind of hit a sweet spot here, we hope. So more to come on that too. But this was a buy-in by all the county departments. We've been talking with the coastal staff to make sure they're sort of going to be supportive of this, we believe. And then also the sheriff's office, which is a really important element, because you can put all kinds of regulations in place, and if you don't have the support and the enforcement, they don't mean anything. And so that's where the 72-hour rule has been frustrating for many of you, because it's hard for them to enforce that. They have to be there. And right now, under the county rule and the state rule, by the way, you can just roll your tire a quarter to turn, and you technically start a new 72-hour rule. What the sheriff used to do is put a penny on top of the tire and then go away for 72 hours and come back. If the penny was gone, they knew the vehicle moved. But now we'll have a requirement of distance you have to move sometime next year, which makes the 72-hour rule much more enforceable. So, huh? Yeah. Do you want to stand up, Sherry, so they can hear you?
Or Mike?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, yeah.
Maybe don't, then it'll just go.
In the commercial. Yeah.
And If people want to look on the website, Bolinas Civic Group has all the proposals from the parking committee published, and so they can review them at another time. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. Appreciate it.
Okay, are we ready to talk about
I think
short-term
we're ready.
rentals? Okay, so most of these questions have the same theme, which is concerns about reductions of short-term rentals in Bolinas. Why is it so difficult to reduce the short-term rentals? Why can't we carve out our community? We're not Stinson Beach or Dillon Beach. We've been struggling. Why is the number not getting reduced? The regulations are slow. Our community's suffering. And then on the same theme, what are the chances that the STR number will get expanded in the future, and what can the community do to prevent that from happening?
So very good questions. I think from my perspective, the county has gone into this process with the idea that we kind of were at a point in time where it was important to develop regulations, but we didn't feel that the number of short-term rentals per se was causing major problems, that we were more worried about thank you. We were more worried about what the controls should be in place to protect future housing. It's really hard in government and decision making and policy making to reverse things, to go back. I understand the wish to go back in time. There's many times in my lifetime I said, oh, I just wish it was still 1975 and there was nobody in downtown Point Reyes Station on weekends, but that's something because I just remember what that was like. So my point being is really hard for government to take stuff away. And so we went into this from the very beginning, signaling that people who had a legitimate short-term rental or signed up through the pre-moratorium for a short-term rental, and I think there was just about 100 that signed up during that 3 weeks before the moratorium was put in place, that those would be honored in the new regulation, that they would be allowed to apply for a license or get a new license if they met all the requirements that the new regulation would put in place. And so that was kind of what we were signaling. And I think there's nobody that I've run across at the county or with my county councilor that believes going backwards is a way that we can go. And so we're kind of honoring that, but we are also looking at, in the caps, going back to the pre-moratorium numbers. So for example, Bolinas initially, if everyone who was legal, signed up during the moratorium, can go through the process of, through the regulation, meet the septic inspection, meet the fire inspection, meet all the requirements, they're able to get a license. And that's 63 short-term rental licenses in Bolinas. Ultimately, the ultimate cap for Bolinas is to go back to the pre-moratorium number, and that was 54. So what we think is initially people won't get qualified or choose not to get a license because they have issues that they can't meet. For example, a septic system that doesn't meet an inspection, they wouldn't be able to get a license. So either that way or through attrition, it will get back to the cap that we want, which is 54. And from my perspective, these caps are pretty well set, that we're going to test them. We're going to see how they work, but we'll check back in 24 months and see what the impacts have been and try and figure out, what the impacts of the caps were. But we don't know what they'll be, but we think they're pretty good numbers at this point. So again, repeating, ultimate caps for Bolinas would be 54 units, which is essentially the pre-moratorium number of legal short-term rentals. Initially, there could be as many as 63 if they all meet the regulations that are in the ordinance, which are fairly rigid. So, that's a test that we're doing at this point. That's the proposal that's going to the Planning Commission. I can tell you there's people out there that in Inverness and other areas, Dillon's Beach, Stinson, I heard on Saturday, that don't even like the idea of caps. I think that's unfortunate because I see the caps as a balancing in our communities. It may not be exactly where you want to be or where you want to have been, but this will set it as a cap going forward so that we can actually continue to maintain the communities as we know them today and try and make improvements through using our land trusts and other measures in terms of creating more housing and creating more affordable workforce housing. So that's the theory behind it. That's how the caps are set. I know even I'm hearing some people saying Dillon's Beach shouldn't have a cap, or maybe Stinson Beach shouldn't have a cap. I'm not there yet. I can tell you quite openly, and I've told both those communities I'm not there yet. I think having some caps in place makes sense because I'm afraid that what the market may do on its own, and the market's never going to fix this problem that we have. We've seen that way too often here. So I'm going to stop there. I know, is there more short-term rental questions? We might as well go ahead and get another one then.
Okay. Other California coastal communities have reduced their short-term rental numbers to 1 to 3% of their housing stock. Why doesn't West Marin deserve the same as those other communities?
So, again, I think I sort of stated a reason why I think that's not likely to happen. The takeaway is really difficult to do with policy. There's another side of this is that we just talked about Measure W and the money it creates. So reducing that funding, how important is that? It's pretty important to me because I went to the voters of all of West Marin, 15,000 people, and said, this is really important to me, and I think you should pass this to support our permanent housing and fire and emergency services. Cutting it by a quarter, by a half, I think is a substantial amount of funding that West Marin wouldn't have anymore. There may be arguments that the vacancies in places will fill the shortfall, but the problem with looking at vacancies is this may not be the times that people want to come. It'd be nice if you thought that people could come all week long and use our whatever vacation rentals we have all week long, but the preferred time is really that weekend period and either side of that period. So I'm worried about that. One thing, if by reducing things. The other thing is that you're talking about a much different scale when you're talking about San Diego saying only 1% of their housing is going to be short-term rentals. The scale of that is huge when you think about it. We're talking about 800 total short-term rentals throughout all of unincorporated Marin and 600 and something here in West Marin. So the scale is much, much different. And we do have a responsibility, and I'm getting reminded every day by the people that want no caps, is we do have a responsibility under the Coastal Act because we're a visitor serving community to serve some of those visitors. And we're serving a small percentage of them, those that are staying overnight. And I don't buy into the other side saying that people visiting the coast will lose some opportunity by not having more short-term rentals, because a lot of people visit the coast and visit Bolinas and go home at night. They don't all try and stay here. And that's a very small piece, but it's an important piece of the economy here. I've heard from workers who are worried that if we cut short-term rentals, they might lose their jobs. So there's many sides of this equation, and it's very, very difficult, again, to take something away. I've heard you loud and clear, but I don't know there's a nexus to what it would gain. We may end up with more vacant houses than the houses that are used for permanent rentals, because part of the short-term rental equation that we don't talk about enough is it's a business plan and a tax plan. Because if you have a short-term rental, that's 100% write-off under tax plans. You can use it 14 days a year and not get penalized, or you can use it anytime you're doing maintenance on it. So it's a real big tax loophole and a business plan that people take advantage of. So it doesn't necessarily equate that they would turn their home into a more permanent rental or longer rental. I'm worried that we would have more vacant homes should we start reducing the number of short-term rentals. But these have a business plan associated to them, with them, and a tax plan that we can't impact.
Okay,
You want to write?
couple more short-term rentals, but on a different.
Fernando, do you want to get
No.
her a card?
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, so these questions relate to enforcement. So the first one is, will the licensing fee be enough and realistic to cover the salary of the enforcement personnel that will be needed? And then is that going to be part of how the county will address short-term rental operating outside of the legal licensing channels?
So there's no relationship to the parking regulation and short-term rental regulation, if that's
No,
the sorry.
these are both on enforcement for short-term rentals.
Oh, okay, sorry.
If I
Okay.
said parking.
So the enforcement on the short-term rental regulations will happen every time there's a new license or a renewal. They would have to go through a series of steps to get the license or to renew it. The new draft has that happening on a 2-year annual renewal, a two-year renewal for the first one, and then it goes to 4 years after that, because one of the things we heard that some of these requirements are not easy to do, that it would be better even for the county, on the county side, to stretch it out to 4 years after the initial 2 years were issued, and the county sort of thought that was a good idea. The enforcement side is, there's a lot of self-certification that is included in this, where you have to self-certify that you have a fire extinguisher, for example, in the structure. You have to self-certify some other things. The septic requirement looks like it's going to be an inspection or a current system on file with environmental health. So if you have a current system on file on environmental health, that they know what it is, that will be acceptable. Or if you don't, you have to get a test, a septic test by an independent contractor, that's sort of similar to what you do when there's a sale on the property. You do an independent inspection to see how the septic's working. The goal of that is just to make sure we have safe and healthy properties for people to visit. Don't have properties with septic systems that aren't working and cause other problems, including problems to maybe the visitors. So that's the intent of that. All the enforcement will be complaint driven. So if things aren't working, the county depends on complaints, although some of the fire districts have expressed an interest on doing an independent inspection for fire safety on short-term rentals in their community. And I think that's going to be considered next week at the Planning Commission. I know we have a letter from at least one fire district that is asking, they want to do inspections on short-term rentals to make sure they meet the fire requirements, which we're quite willing to work with fire districts and have them do that. The county is not going to do that for county-wide, though. They'll accept the self-certification, and that's the practice, and then it would be complaint-driven. The reason that we included something in this regulation that was in the original Good Neighbor regulation, but we pulled out, was some sort of a discrete signage on the properties that are short-term rentals. And the reason we're doing that is for a couple things. It notifies the neighbors. It gives the neighbors a place to complain or a phone number to complain to. But it also helps us with enforcement, because we know if they have a sign, and we know that they're a legal entity and they're operating as a legal entity. If you see something being used as a short-term rental and they don't have an approved sign on their building somewhere, then you know that would be one you'd want to complain about. And so we're trying to make this regulation workable and enforceable for the county, and trying to figure out ways that will happen with self-certification, county doing inspections when there's a complaint, and making it easier to know what is a short-term rental and what isn't in your communities. So that's the effort. For enforcement is always a question when it comes to the county, and the process of the county is it's complaint driven at this point, but the regulatory process up front is pretty rigid to meet all the requirements, including the septic inspection that you'd have to do to actually get the license initially. Generally, from the complaints we've gotten over the last 4 years with host compliant, very few complaints in West Marin. Almost all the complaints were over in Tam Valley, where people were using their short-term rentals as party houses. Now, I don't know if that's because people in West Marin weren't complaining, or that they're just sort of better operators in West Marin, and they take care of their properties better and they're managing them better. I like to think it's the latter, but we may not be hearing about all the complaints that are out here. Next.
Next is the short-term rental again, but why was the distinction between hosted and unhosted eliminated in the recent draft?
So the county's definition of hosted really was related to the policy that's already in place that recognized B&Bs, bed and breakfasts. And that's not part of this ordinance. B&Bs are a separate ordinance off by themselves. And the way we defined hosted, it really was a B&B because you had to be on site certain hours of the day. And so we were hearing from people who wanted to make the hosted more relaxed and open up for opportunities for people to go away for a couple months and rent their house, which is a great idea, but it's almost unenforceable. And we just can't track it enough to know who's doing what. And so we decided, county planning staff and the subcommittee that works for them, subcommittee of the board, which is myself and Stephanie Moulton Peters, decided that it was getting way too complicated and we needed to simplify this ordinance, and that hosted was never going to be what we thought hosted should be, because they're getting too many expectations out there that I should be able to go away for a summer and rent my house out as a short-term rental. And from our perspective, that's not the hosted that we're looking for. We want people on site. And so we said, look, we're just going to call them all as short-term rentals and not distinguish between hosted and unhosted. Call them all the same, count them all, and let the B&Bs be the hosted model, which we think is an excellent model, and we support that. But it is an older model, and it's not well accepted in the short-term rental industry. So that's the reason. Again, simplifying the ordinance, simplifying the enforcement, and really reflecting what we really originally wanted to be as part of the ordinance for hosted, which really was bed and breakfast. So, and that's where we've gone with that. There was an effort to simplify the regulation with the redraft, and this was part of that.
Okay. Have all the county supervisors publicly stated if they own a short-term rental eligible property under the proposed rules in West Marin, and if they currently operate or hold a license to run one?
So I'm not aware that any board members run or operate a short-term rental. I do know one of the planning commissioners have already stated that she did. Our West Marin representative has stated that she owns a short-term rental. You know, if you owned a short-term rental in West Marin, I think you'd be conflicted out of voting on this ordinance, so that won't happen until it gets to the board. Just yesterday, was yesterday Tuesday? Yeah, just yesterday, I recused myself from a parking ordinance in Point Reyes Station because I happen to have a family home that I still own part ownership in, just down the street from where the ordinance was going to be enacted. So, you know, we're pretty cautious about that. Even the appearance of conflict, we usually recuse ourselves. I've not heard anyone say that they feel conflicted at this point, but we would know more when they got to the Board of Supervisors. So, you know, out of full disclosure, I have a brother who has a short-term rental in Marshall, and know a lot of people that have short-term rentals. But the house that I own with my siblings in downtown Point Reyes Station is a permanent rental. So.
Okay, next question is, why not close the tax loopholes for short-term rentals and second homeowners to make it economically less advantage to have a second home?
Thank you. Boy, that's probably a good idea, but it's much bigger than me and county government when you're talking about tax laws. That probably would be a good subject to talk to Congressman Huffman about, and or the state, because they both have tax laws. But they generally benefit this sort of thing. You know, I did a lot of work in construction and working for people with second homes, and was very fortunate to have a great business. But, you know, I recognize with many of them, whether they were in short-term rental business or not, those homes were truly second homes, and they didn't use them enough. And the ones that were in short-term rentals, they were taking advantage of every tax advantage they could, because it favors them. So that would help if that changed. I think some of the rules around claiming mortgage deductions may have helped. But again, if you're doing a short-term rental, that's a business, and you're not limited to that mortgage deduction in a short-term rental, only in your private residence. So again, an incentive almost to do short-term rental from tax incentive. So.
Okay, and then this is the last question that I have. So if anyone has any more, now's the time to submit them. And I don't know if there's any in the chat. I haven't looked. Looks like there's not. What is the number of available units of full-time rentals versus owner-occupied, including weekenders and short-term rentals?
That's data that we would love to have, and we've been attempting to get that for a couple years now. We actually have a requirement in the Just Cause ordinance that permanent rentals get registered with the county. We've not been really successful. You actually, if you don't know this, if you do a permanent rental, you're supposed to have a business license. Most people don't realize that. That's the mechanism we would normally track it, but most people don't get a business license for a permanent rental. And so we don't have a lot of data on that. We don't know those numbers, and that is a problem, not having the data. But we're trying to figure out ways to get those. And one of the ways we did was require in the Just Cause policy that you actually register your permanent rental with the county, but it's not been successful. And in particular, it's not been successful in West Marin. We're a little private about information that we want to give to the county. And I'm sorry. Yeah. And I am interested in hearing from more of you about what sorts of incentives you think would be useful to encourage short-term rentals that maybe couldn't get a license, for example, because they had something going on that they couldn't qualify. Is there something that the county should do? And I don't know, it doesn't think it needs to be part of this regulation, but it could be something we put in our housing plans, for example, that people that actually convert to permanent housing have some benefit in some way. We tried to do some things with taxes and stuff, and again, property tax laws are so cumbersome, and many of them are dictated by the state. It's hard to do the incentives to say, we'll give you a property tax cut, because it just doesn't work that way. And part of it is because more than half, 3/4 of your property tax actually goes to the state and then comes back to schools and stuff. The county ends up with about 25% of your property tax. So it's hard to say, we'll give you an incentive, half your property tax, when you're taking it away from someone else, schools and or state. So it has to be a bigger initiative than the county to get to that. But anyway, I don't need to hear it tonight, but I'd love to hear ideas that you have, and maybe through the land trust you could provide information. What sort of incentives can we really work on that would be meaningful for encouraging people to get out of short-term rentals and get into permanent rentals? And I know people do it because it's the right thing to do, and I applaud that. But you have to remember that if you're an absentee owner, it might have to be a pretty heavy incentive to actually make that decision. David, go ahead. I'll just give you a quick question. You want to come up? Thank you. Sorry. Sorry about that.
I'm David Kimball, and for those of you that don't know me, my wife and I have been here 34 years and been pretty active. Dennis, you have, when you first ran for supervisor, Bolinas voted for you. And even though Steve Kinsey prevailed and held his seat, we voted for you ever since. And it's been good. You have served us well. Measure W, Measure C, all the things you talked about tonight, we've really benefited from your leadership. We need you now more than ever. Here's a finding that was used to justify the short-term rental moratorium in May of 2022. This is part of the ordinance. The shortage of affordable permanent housing hollows out West Marin communities. It causes increase in property values and reduces availability of local employee housing, which in turn forces emergency responders, teachers, and other essential public service workers to live outside the West Marin area, creating a teacher shortage and delays in emergency and public services. Lack of permanent housing has further caused school enrollment in the area to decline, impacting revenues to all districts. Nothing like that appears in the draft ordinance that CDA just put in front of the Planning Commission for Monday's hearing. If we take nearly 10% of our houses and set them aside as short-term rentals, it's a given they will never become a long-term housing option for somebody. And we need you more than ever. Yes, takings are a bear. Up and down the coast, not even in the coast, across the countries, jurisdictions are taking on the takings issue. And that evidence has been put in front of the Planning Commission. So we can't be complacent. We don't want to go back to 1975. What we want to do is be a community again for now and into the future. We can't do that where we are now. We need you more than ever. Your voters need you more than ever. And we really appreciate all that you've done for us. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, thank you, David. I appreciate that. And I appreciate the acknowledgement too. And I know there's a lot more work to do around all these issues, and, I guess those statements are very valid and true. They certainly are more narrative than factual in terms of some people's opinion. And that's what's been disputed up and down the coast in all the conversations we've had, depending on your perspective. But we actually recognize it's real. It's a real thing, that our teachers aren't here and our schools are getting smaller and those sorts of things. And that's why and I felt so strongly about the T Ranch, that those residents had to stay in Bolinas, that it was way too impactful. We could provide them housing somewhere else. And I told staff, that's not an alternative. We can't do this to the community, because these are people that work in the community and kids that go to school, and we're stressed already. We're small already, and we can't afford to lose anyone. And so, that's how I approach this work. I hear what you're saying. I'm just not sure that there's a justification to cut beyond what we're proposing at this point. Like you said, I don't think majority of these will end up in our permanent housing stock. Yeah, I get that. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
We can't hear you on the Zoom.
Yeah.
And so if you could
She
write
said
it down.
offer
or
incentives is
offer
what she
incentives,
said.
okay.
Yeah. And we've heard that too. So, again, we're at a different place at this point. We disagree. I'm listening to everyone, trying to entertain everyone. You should come to the Point Reyes meeting next week. I'm sure you're going to hear perhaps a different opinion there. I've certainly heard a different opinion in Dillon's Beach, and in Stinson Beach actually on Saturday also. So this is a balancing act, and we're trying to stop the hollowing out of our communities, and that's why we think the caps are important. So the discussion really comes down, what is the caps? And I totally get that. At the Village Association, yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I should have said this is a Marshall, Point Reyes, and Inverness community conversation, so it's a little broader than Point Reyes. I think you said something, a question, I'm sorry.
The question was, is why can't it be carved out for Bolinas different than other, is that right, Tina? Dillon Beach is different and Seadrift have different, why can't it be carved out different for Bolinas?
I think we are doing that, but we're just hung up, we're all negotiating the cap. We are carving out Bolinas to be different essentially, because we could have just gone a cap 16% across the county, that's what other communities have done, or 10% across the county. But we didn't think that was right, given the history of our communities, namely Dillon's Beach and Stinson Beach were very different from the get-go. And we didn't feel at that point that saying 10% in Dillon's Beach or Stinson Beach was a practical way to approach this, since they were already in excess, one being 28% and the other being almost 30. So, that we have taken and individualized this. I think the dispute is the county's not quite there where you want us to be, but we have individualized it by saying, we're holding Bolinas at roughly 10%. So that's been the commitment.
Okay. So,
Next question.
Dennis, we have some teachers here from the school district that wanted to speak.
Sure.
So I'm going to let them take the mic.
Yep. Will's okay, I'm okay.
Do you guys just want to go over there so everyone can see on the camera?
Yeah, there you go.
They're going to go up front to the camera so everyone can see them, so I don't have to move the camera.
I know, how are you? Good to see you.
So I'm a public school teacher. I've been working here for 12 years, and I heard you say that the county has to catch up, and today we lost a family, a student that had to move out. Just today we said goodbye because there wasn't any housing available permanently for this family that we love, so it's a big sadness and loss. And we were just looking at our enrollment, and we had 119 students, 74% of them have insecure housing right now. If any of them were to lose their housing, this is it. There's nothing else available for any of these families. We need them. We're service workers, we're educators, and we need our children, we need the students, and we need to support the families now. So the catching up is too late, the way we see it, but thank you.
I don't really have a lot to add to that. That was so well spoken and so heartfelt. I lived in Bolinas before Airbnb, and I live in Bolinas now, and it's a different landscape, and it has been devastating to so many families. To my own family, my former apartment in Stinson Beach is now a short-term rental. I through an act of God, found a place to land here in Bolinas. And, the next eviction will be my last here. And while I teach people how to sit down on the school bus, I like living here. I like my community. What of it is still here. And I would just encourage you, Dennis, to I really like you, and I think you're great. And I worked, and I made phone calls for Measure W, and I was on the committee to decide where the funds went. And I think you're doing a good job. But I think on this issue, if you want to be remembered for doing a great job, you'll change your mind.
Okay, and I have another question here, is what happened to the idea for extra housing by requiring that a resident is on site if they're eligible to have a short-term rental?
Sure. So I think what happened with that was the state law changed regarding ADUs. Accessory dwelling units, I thought was a good way to maybe allow a new short-term rental license if they committed to building an ADU and then using one of the two structures as a permanent rental, because then it's a one-for-one. You lose one, you gain one. So I thought that was a good trade-off. But with new state law, that it doesn't allow ADUs to be used for short-term rentals, that kind of eliminated that possibility. So it would have to be, they'd have to rent the main house. Is that right? Yeah, no, they'd have to use the ADU for the permanent and use the main house as a short-term rental. You know, we could still consider that, but we think the law being really restrictive doesn't give the option of grandma using her house as a short-term rental and living in the ADU, or grandma and grandpa living in the ADU and renting their house as a short-term rental. So that's what happened to that proposal. I thought it was a good one when we first thought of it, but that was before the state law changed to banning ADUs. And there's a date on ADUs, just by the way. I think it's January 2020 was when the state law changed, and anything before that still can be used as a short-term rental, but everything after that cannot be. So, yeah.
Um,
I mean, you know, they were trying to build permanent housing, and that was their only thought was, we can't use these for short-term rentals. It made sense to somebody at the time. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a good idea, and, you know, I'd be more than happy to talk with Senator McGuire and Conley, Assemblymember Conley too, about if they've gotten any other feedback from their other parts of their community. You know, there's a lot of priorities, as you know, Ariane, and it's hard to prioritize some of these things ahead of others, but it's certainly something that might be important down the road. Wouldn't impact us at this point, but. Sure. Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
Yes, we do. Okay. Bolinas residents want a lower short-term rental number than proposed in the draft ordinance. Corte Madera just passed an ordinance limiting short-term rentals to 75 nights and primary residences only, which is what we want. Would you support a ballot measure allowing Bolinas residents to vote on a measure restricting short-term rentals to 75 nights in your primary residence only?
So, first of all, I'm very fond of initiatives and bond measures, and so I certainly would probably support it. I just don't know the political entity that you'd have to deal with, because Bolinas is not recognized as a city and not incorporated. So I don't know how maybe BPUD can be that entity, very likely. But you'd have to look into that. But it only takes 10% of the voters from the last general election signatures to get an initiative on the ballot. So if that's something that the community wanted to do, and, you know, perhaps registered voters in the community are the majority at this point. They're usually people that live here.
But the Zoom can't hear you guys.
They can't hear you, sorry.
But we also have more questions. We have 5 minutes. And so let me read the questions on the cards. So why allow corporations to own short-term rentals, which is a zoning violation?
Yeah, no, good question. And we don't believe there's a lot of corporations that own short-term rentals from the data that we can pull in West Marin. It doesn't mean it won't happen. So what we chose is a safer route, legal route, because restricting the types of ownership is really difficult sometimes. And we chose the route of one short-term rental per person, basically. And that was the route we took to limit corporations, because we're going to look at the owners of the corporations, if there is one, to make sure they don't already own a property under their individual names. So that's the approach that we've decided to take, and much of that was directed by legal staff saying this is a safe approach in the way that we recommend it. I have to say, just so those of you that read the revised ordinance, so there are some grandfathering in of places that have more than one short-term rental, and that was a recommendation from the Planning Commission to staff after the last workshop, which grandfathered in some properties. Again, they're still in the count, they're still in the cap. They're not going to increase it, the number, but some people who have multiple short-term rentals will be allowed to keep those short-term rentals until their license expires for violating the regulations. They change their property, sell their property, then it goes away. There's nothing in short-term rental regulation because they're issued to the individual. None of those go with the property. So there's no way you can transfer it to a new owner, which I think is a positive thing about this ordinance. It finally, even though business licenses were the same, they were a blunt instrument when it came to really controlling this. This ordinance says you can't transfer. You can't transfer to a new owner, and that new owner can only apply for a license or getting the waiting list. Apply for a license and get one if it's under the cap already, or sit in the waiting list until there's a unit available.
So we're gonna hold on.
Not to own residential property, no.
We're gonna run out of time. Okay.
Well, that's a bigger question about residential properties and using short-term rentals. That's what I was referring to. It's an oddity in the zoning code because it really is more of a commercial use of residential property, and I recognize that, but it's kind of like the cat's out of the bag already, and we didn't control it. We had no mechanism to control it when it started. And
Okay. So we're gonna.
yeah, I appreciate that. And the county is not individualizing regulations by community. We made a decision early on that that's not manageable for us to set up different regulations in different communities. We would never be able to follow through with the enforcement. And so the general regulations are being set up that apply to everyone, unincorporated wide, and the caps are the only thing that we're individualizing at this point with the proposal. And it really is being honest that we can't do some of the things you want to do. If you take that on and have to do the enforcement, I wish you the best of luck, and you'll have some local responsibility. Yeah, I'm not sure why San Diego set the cap where it did. Again, sure, sure. So
Okay.
what I'm hearing your proposal is you're fine with as many short-term rentals as we're proposing, but you want the cap to be lower. That's not consistent with what. So, so that's because Bolinas and Stinson and Dillon's Beach are so high. Yeah.
They will fill the cap. Ultimately, they will fill the cap. Maybe there will be no STR.
I guess I'm going back to the question I posed. Are you saying you can live with 63 short-term rentals if the cap was set lower or cut in half, no. Well, that's not what you said. You said that what existing was fine. You'd get back through attrition.
2% and then over time.
Yeah.
Like I'm trying to figure out like how do we get to a place that we feel good?
Sure.
Like you're gonna treat us all the same.
Yeah. So, but you're asking for a 50% cut to the cap that we're proposing. And I was just asking, are you saying that the number 63 is okay and attrition is okay to get to that? Okay. I get it. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Thank you. Yep.
Okay. And then, well, yours was right here. So, there's a lot of statements in here that were not questions, that were not asked. So I'm going to bring those back to our office. We have those, and we'll be able to reply back. We'll figure out a way potentially to put some of these up or figure out how we want to do that. And then the last question that was here, which I know we're on time, but this is a question on incentives and thinking about the incentives proposed by the West Marin residents for housing and where those are in the process.
So I talked with staff and they don't believe that this regulation is the place for incentives, but they've agreed to look at those as part of the housing element implementation. Because they think that's a better place for them to do it more generally, to do the incentives, which would include for short-term rentals, people that want to shift from short-term rental. But they didn't believe this regulation was a place for that. And you know, that's staff opinion. I sort of agree with them that we need to do this more thoroughly and more generally to give incentives for people to do permanent rentals. So that's the answer to that. Thank you for the suggestions, and any others I welcome for sure.
I had a question that you're saying is comment, so you're not going to ask it, but it's not about short-term rentals. It's about getting a link, a transit link, a transportation link from Bolinas to Olima, because we are being held hostage there, our post office, and people do not have a way to get there.
Yeah.
Some people. So can you please
Yep.
help us get that link connected from Bolinas to Olima?
Sure. Yep. Yeah, we've kind of been talking even before the post office about some sort of north-south link, and I've been talking with Marin Transit about that. Right now, as you know, transit's stressed everywhere, and in Marin Transit is no different. It's mostly around finding drivers. So if you have anyone that wants to drive bus, there's a lot of opportunities. Yes, thank you. That's a good comment. Anyway, but I'll return to them and bring up the subject matter again. I talked to them originally. You brought it up when you were in Olima, and then it flooded, and you moved to Stinson, and then the problem was kind of solved. And so we need to resurrect that conversation again, because you're back in Olima. Although I did predict to the congressman's office, I gave him about 8 weeks until they were back in Stinson because of the flooding. So anyway.
I think
Anything
that was
else?
it. No.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here. Appreciate it. I truly heard you tonight. I understand where you're coming from. You know, I hate to disagree, but right now I think I'd say I politely disagree, and we'll continue to work on this and see if we can come up with other solutions. Thank you. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, that is possible by a vote.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.